So I would like to thank you for inviting me to come and speak here and present our museum, the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp. This is it's a museum exploited by the city, but it's an historical museum. So what I will tell you right now will be about how a museum, you can see it over here. This is the City Museum of Antwerp, the Mas. This is where we are located in the old Antwerp harbor. These are the original buildings of the Red Star Line Shipping Company. That company sailed from 1873 to 1934 towards North America, and immigrants from all over Europe came here to take the boat. So the Red Star Line Museum opened in 2013. This was how it looked like when it was operational. It was a control station for the third class, so it was a little bit the mirror image of Ellis Island. People had to do the same checks before they boarded the ships, because if they were sent back from New York, the shipping lines themselves had to pay for the deportation, so they wanted to avoid that. This is how it looked like before the renovation started, and we opened in 2013. Perhaps just another word for the inception. So the main and initial idea was to revive that story, that historical migration story, that specific story also, limited in time and in space, Antwerp, and the history of a company. And it was pretty much funded by the city from a policy of city renewal. This whole area. So you have the city center, the historical center, somewhat down south. This whole area is the old harbor. 10 years ago it was run down, it was deserted, it was dilapidated. So the city used museums to start a dynamic of urban renewal with the Mas and then us later. But at the same time, a scientific committee was appointed, and that defined the interpretation of the lieu de mémoire of the site as something that was very much about the broad human experience of migration. As I said, in our buildings, only third-class passengers. We aimed to make this particular story as something that represents something much larger and something that's also relevant today. And that will be my talk today on how we depart from that historical story. It always stays the core of our narrative, but we try to broaden the scope of our museum workings, both in our exhibitions and in other projects that we are doing on migration today and worldwide. And for that, the main point or the main focus where it all goes around is, and of course that's also not something new, is personal stories. We started to work heavily with personal stories just because we had this mission from the scientific committee that we ought to make a museum about the history of third-class people, about poor immigrants, but we didn't find any objects of them because objects belong mostly, rich people have a lot of objects and poor people don't have a lot of objects. So we started going around. The Ellis Island Oral History Project was a very big inspiration. We found some biographies in the Institute for Jewish Research in New York. We found a nucleus of interviews and biographies of immigrants, and we started to work with that. Via reverse genealogy, we tracked down descendants and family members that were still alive to contact them, to ask them if they still had pictures or memorabilia relating to those stories in their family's archives, and we brought them over to Antwerp. And that kind of created a dynamic, and that dynamic resulted in the fact that we as researchers very much made or developed our exhibition involving with the involvement of the public, and also, and a little bit to our amazement at first, creating really a community of people that through their history, through their family history, even sometimes through their personal history, got very involved with what we are doing and with our museum. This is Maurice Moel on his 100th birthday. This was somebody we learned to know as one of the last survivors of the Red Star Line era. He was born in Ukraine in 1912. He fled, or he got separated from his father, who was in America during the First World War. And after the First World War, he fled with his mother and with his siblings in very precarious conditions towards the United States. So that's for our historical research. At the same time, because we had that vision that, the committee had the vision that the narrow historical story stands for something more broader, we also started going around in our city in search for contemporary migration stories. This is our, we called it the transit van. It's a for transit. But it's also about people who are in transit, who are on the move. We converted it, you can see it just a little bit over here, into I should use this, into a nice studio where we could go around all these tiny activities and gatherings of communities, of societies, and we could broaden also our, we could find a base for our museum amongst contemporary Antwerpians, also on contemporary immigrant communities, and we started collecting the stories as well. This was a studio where you could sit in and have an interview or just leave your data just as you choose to be. So the result of that was that we have now an exhibition with next to the historical story, also some contemporary stories, and the link between between history and contemporary. And when you this is also a screenshot from a movie that the artist Hans Op de Beek made to based on the historical story, but taking abstract concepts out of it and giving it a broader meaning. So we make the link explicitly with the contemporary world, but also the way we tell, the way we tell our historical stories is very much influenced by the fact that we did that research at the same time. If you talk to people who really lived what you are trying to tell with historical characters, that really influences you in the way how you tell a story, and was as much an enrichment as all the interview transcripts or archival materials or books that you can imagine. So we opened with that permanent exhibition, and decided that that participation with the audience and the audience involvement, which helped us and moved us so a lot in the preparation of the museum, that was also the way forward for us in the future development of the museum. So in our guided tours, participation and interaction is very much at the forefront. When we held a selection to hire our guides, we didn't so much look at who knew a lot, who had a lot of information, who read a lot of books, who has the extensive knowledge of port history of Antwerp, but we looked at people who we thought could really engage with the audience, who could stimulate them and entice them to share their stories and to go into interaction with each other. We also give them a training. We give them strengthening those competences. So how to deal with, for example, if you have a group and there are different tendencies or there are different meanings about migrations or feeling, how do you mediate with that? And of course they have to know the data and the facts, and they have to have the knowledge. But especially for the selection and as an emphasis in the training, participation and interaction with the audience was very important for us. This is probably also something we had first talks with 4 comparable museums in Flanders. So there's the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp that is dedicated to migration. There's the In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres that is dedicated to the First World War, but also wants to tell a much larger story about war and peace. And there's the Dossin-Kazerne in Mechelen, and that was a center where Jews and Gypsies and other captives of the Nazi regime were deported. We are considering a joint program and where we can share experiences on guided tours and how to mediate with the public, both for personal stories and for feelings or positions on the topic, how to go on with that. I've put here also the museum staff. We make it a point of honor that if a visitor comes to our desk and he says, my great-grandfather took the Finland, that was a ship of the Red Star Line, he took it to go to the United States, and I still have a picture here of him on his farm in Milwaukee. Or we have a contemporary migrant who wants to share something. We make it a point of honor that there's always somebody in the museum of the staff, of the scientific or the educational staff available to receive that person, to have a coffee, to talk a little bit with them and to see if they want to donate or record their story or share it or to add it to the collection. We also have some digital, I've put them there to give the complete picture. We also have some digital tools. People can, via our website and also on screens at the end of the exhibition, they can download a sort of a form, and there they can upload and put in their family story or their immigration story and share it with us. They can also print it for them, and then they have this nice template that they can guard or keep in their family. I have to say that this right now is a little bit under re-evaluation because the digital way of working isn't proving as effective as the personal way of working. So we really have to look into how this all fits into the broader picture. And we also have available for teachers. We have a lot of classes. We have a lot of what we call NT2 classes. Those are classes where you can learn. Those are Dutch classes for newly arrivals, and also for them, we try to let them engage with the content of our museum through their own story. So as we go onwards now that we've opened, I will just give a short overview from some programs, exhibitions, and publications that we did, broadening and making the connection with today. I want to tell you a little bit more about how we see the power of those personal stories, and I will end with some new things we are doing right now and some thoughts on that. So first, we use, so in 13 we opened with the main exhibition. I talked about that earlier. We also try to have a program of some temporary exhibitions that are not connected to the Red Star Line story. For example, in 2014, we had an exhibition on the yearly exodus, as we called it, of the Moroccan community in Antwerp to spend their summer in the country of their roots. And a lot of families, as most of you perhaps know, they do it. It's kind of a yearly ritual, and we had an exhibition on that, on the occasion of the celebration, as you can call it, like of the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the signage of the guest workers agreement between the Belgian government and the Moroccan and the Turkish government. So we had that, we had a photo reportage, but we also had family stories, and people via an Instagram page could also entice people through the use of some ambassadors of the museum. So we contacted ourselves some people of which we thought had a high profile within the community. And they started posting Instagram photos and little messages and blogs on their journey towards Morocco, and that enticed other people to do the same thing. We also, if we try to do those kind of participatory projects, we also try to make sure that the museum gives back something in return. For example, people who participated in that, they got a photographic workshop as well. Ali's boat was last year, and that was from the Dutch Iraqian artist Sajid Al-Fraji, and he made a whole installation based on this drawing from his nephew. It's still in Iraq, and this is a boat that is a traditional boat that is used in the Biafra, around Biafra in the Delta, and for this boat means symbolizes his longing to get out of there and to come to his uncle in Holland, and it's kind of also a it's a little bit an analogy of the boats that crossed the ocean in the 19th century. We're not only doing those temporary exhibitions, we have books. This was a play for schools that we made in cooperation with a theater company. So what is for us the importance of migration story, and I would like to attend you on this term. For me, it's very inspiring. We learned it from a conversation with one of the peoples that we are working with, and that is, I think, and all that we are trying to do is catching the ultraviolet, so the things that are there, the light that is there, but it's very difficult to see. And even in history and in society, I think the deputy mayor talked about that a couple of minutes ago. There are all these little things are happen in Antwerp. We would like to catch them, we would like to bring them in our museum, but there is also a lot of history that's on the personal level that isn't in the archives, that is forgotten. We also want to bring that back up, and also with the idea that what is happening today will eventually become history. So we are interviewing and collecting these migration stories to document a social phenomenon that is otherwise, according to us, not as deeply documentable as it is now. Migration stories is, for us, it also links the past with the present. I think, and I saw in the program that there's a video of the Tenement Museum coming on late. I don't know if anybody from the museum is here, but their mission statement is for us very inspiring. I don't know it by heart, but there's this sentence in it linking migrants and the public, both present and past. And for us, that's instrumental, and those personal experiences and migration stories is the way to do that. If I was telling about the links that we are making in the permanent exhibition, it is not about migrants were then welcome and they're now not welcome. If that was even the case, it's not comparing societies, but it's looking for the universal dimensions of immigrants then and now, and invoking empathy. By the way, we are a museum that has I would not say really extreme right wing, but a lot of people come to our museum attracted by, they are attracted by the historical narrative of the immigrants, and for us it's a little bit, we hope or we strive to also make them think about contemporary migration today, and it is a little bit our feeling that if you would do that directly and would confront them, you would perhaps scare them away, but doing it a little bit indirectly, for example, by the use of history, you can still at least try to make them reflect on it, and by that way, hopefully unifying people. And so here we are with the last point, connecting, building a heritage community. I talked about the educational instrument, and of course, if you let people tell their story and you give them the, for example, from the city, sometimes it works the other way around. You give them the signal that their story means something, and that at least symbolically you are taking their lives into the city that means something for them. And for example, we had a NT2 evening a couple of months ago, and a couple of years ago, and the participants said, by knowing that Antwerp was also a place where people left, and they had the same experience as I have, I feel more at home here. So what we are doing now, we are setting up some projects, and we are launching, for us in the museum at least, a new term, and that's called co-creation, by which we are investigating possibilities not only to use the people we're working with as sources and to suck them dry and let it be there, but to really incorporate them in the whole process, and catching that ultraviolet, those creative minds, those things that are happening in the city, and work with them throughout the whole trajectory. This is something, this is an evening we hosted a couple of weeks ago. It was at the end of a project that we did with an organization who accompanies, who helps unaccompanied young refugees. So through the intermediary of the peoples of those organizations, have a trust relation with them. We worked with them on getting their stories. They wrote texts about it, and we had one evening in the museum where they took the museum over, and when you had guided tours through their where you could see their stories, and then at the end there was this conversation on stage. The challenges that we see for this kind of work is, at first, it's you really need to have a sustained effort. We are not the first one, and also not in Antwerp, who are trying to do something with the immigrant community, getting them involved and so on, and making contacts and connecting. That, as probably some of you also know, that takes a lot of work, gaining trust and so on. You cannot do that in a project of 6 months or a year or a year and a half. And a lot of the times, those efforts, they are the efforts you put into a project, or you apply grants for it because it's not really the core working of your museum. So you want to do something, so you take a grant, but then you have a trajectory of life that is limited in time, and what do you do then with the results? They fade away again. So our effort now also in how we are formulating our policy, how we are seeking support from the city, and how we are trying to search funds on the long term, is just to make this a sustained effort and to have all these beginnings of contacts and of a network to really keep on developing them over the years, and really make it as one of the core things of our museum. I wrote the conflict of interest. I briefly hinted on it already. That for me, that's especially for me as a historian by training, that's another challenge. I believe in the power of documenting and preserving for the future. That's a mission on its own. But sometimes, for example, we are trying to set up a project with which we will follow 5 asylum seekers for 5 years and see what's going on with them. Will they tell? They have an interest in the way they tell their story. Do you interfere with it? Don't you interfere with it? Do you help them? Don't you help with them? These are all these moral issues that we come across with, and this I think are very important to take into account, especially when working with groups and vulnerable groups as refugees. I've wrote it down. We are trying now to set up a multi-generational project, oral history project on child refugees. We are dreaming of having this exhibition in 2021, which is then the Convention of Geneva 70 years onwards. And I just wrote a little bit like an afterthought about the current affairs of what is happening now. It strikes me that when we opened our museum in 2013, we were perceived as a step forward into the debate because we had our focus on the personal narrative. We didn't compare societies. We stayed out of the contradictory debate. In some museums you have, are immigrants good for society, yes or no? We never did that, and at that time that was perceived as something good because a big museum in Antwerp opened. We had some reviews in the national press, and then they said, finally someone who tries to, or an institution who tries to do normal about migration, who tries to mainstream the problematic, and that was then perceived as the way to go. But now, the events of the last years with the refugee crisis, the immigration ban, the Muslim ban, whatnot, we get more and more the signals of you're keeping silent. So what was first a strong point now becomes a little bit something that, well, we are really under attack. But sometimes you hear this criticism. You know, you have these feelings. You have the tear jerkers. You have this. You have that. But you're not really going into the issues that are as hand. So I think that is all. Although we very much believe in what we are doing, this is always something that we have to take into account, and that is not so easy, especially for a city museum that is supposed to be neutral. So thank you.
Very much.